Welcome viewers to MOOC's online course on Introduction to Indian Art and Appreciation. This is the fourth and last week running, and as you know, this week we are trying to trace the transition of Indian art from the tradition to modern. In the last two modules, we have seen that how this transition was manifesting itself in various kinds of works of art, mainly paintings. We have seen the initial unsureness, the uncertainty of the artworks and of the artists when the Britishers arrived in India and they were responsible for creating that rupture. We have also seen how or in what circumstances the company painting emerged as a kind of response to the new set of requirements or the new needs from the British rulers. And most of these artists involved in the company paintings or company school of paintings were Indians, and they trained Indians in a certain way by admitting them in various art schools which they had established, the British rulers had established in India, all in mid-19th century. And the Indian painters, many of them themselves became very well equipped with this new skill, with this new technique to record scenery, to record life, to record the social and cultural events visually with a great skill and realism. Now they don't need British rulers, British painters at all. Now interestingly, at the turn of the century, that is, let us say in the late 19th century and early 20th century, we also witnessed the emergence of a new kind of painters, new kind, not necessarily always technically, but with a new inclination, let us say. And what was that inclination? Basically to not necessarily digest what the British rulers want you to digest, but to think otherwise, to look for an Indian identity in their work, in their skill, in their technique, in their subject matter. In other words, a new generation, a whole new generation of artists began to react, not necessarily violently always, but in some way or the other they started reacting against this colonial art system, this colonial art language. Now we have already seen, maybe you are aware of this famous artist of mid-19th century called Raja Ravi Verma. He was even senior to Rabindranath Tagore, so he had lived the time, he had seen the arrival of the British rulers, and he has seen how the presence of the British in India was changing the entire scenario of art traditions. But instead of bickering, what Ravi Verma did was also very interesting. He picked up, and he picked it up very well. He picked up the technique of Western or European oil painting with that kind of realism and photographic accuracy, everything very well. But instead of doing Western subject, he started painting Indian subject matter and also mythology. So traditional mythological, Indian mythological paintings now being done by Ravi Verma in Western European realistic mode. You can call this again a hybrid painting, a hybrid style. But at least we can say that Ravi Verma, instead of succumbing or surrendering to the need or to the demands of the colonial rulers, he was at least trying to figure out something different on his own, trying to figure out how to take the advantage of the situation, make the best of the both worlds. I mean, take advantage of this new European realistic language, and instead of doing European subject matters, how he could show Indian feelings, Indian emotions, Indian tradition, Indian mythology in European subject matter in a very realistic way. So, I would not say that this is a very strong reaction against the company or the colonial art system or art ideas, but in a way it is a very interesting development that had already taken place in mid 19th century. Now, in late 19th century, you also get to see somebody like, so that the emergence of interesting artists, and now you can see somebody like Amrita Shergill. So, when you look at her works, and she is half European, half Indian, so she had the training of an European art training method. So, she knew how to handle oil painting, she knew how to handle realistic methods of doing an oil painting, but he gave up all those. She gave up all those, and she started looking at the possibilities of doing Indian subject matters in oil paintings, and she also tried to transform the European method of oil painting into an Indian look, to give it a kind of Indian look. So, Amrita Shergill was a very interesting artist that way, and again, not that she was outspokenly or very openly commenting on the colonial art system or was reacting against the colonial art system, but Amrita Shergill's works, they a kind of evidence of a new mindset of Indian artists who refuse to accept in a way whatever the colonial rulers would be asking you to do, but instead trying to find out an alternative path, and this is what exactly she did. Amrita Shergill tried to find out an alternative path of painting, not necessarily following the traditional method, not necessarily following or imitating the European modern art models, but trying to develop a modern art rooted in the Indian soil. Unfortunately, she died very young and she was unable to actually complete her project. Otherwise, she was a very promising artist. Now, after Ravi Verma and Amrita Shergill, we have this enormously powerful artist from Bengal, from Calcutta, Abanindranath Tagore. Now, Abanindranath Tagore can be identified as one of the truly nationalist painter who outrightly rejected the colonial art aesthetics or the colonial project of art. I mean, this is how the Indians now should paint, they should almost behave like company painters. No. Rather, Abanindranath developed his own method of painting. He tried to assert his own subject matters, and instead of following the colonial aesthetic norms, Abanindranath Tagore very interestingly and very courageously, he almost became the icon of a truly nationalist art. Not that all his paintings are like that, but there are many paintings by him, many works of art by him, which are kind of evidence of art made for a national cause, as against the colonial rulers, as against the British rulers. So, this is how we can see Abanindranath Tagore, partially though, that he is a very important artist, also because he was very experimental, he was a multi-talented artist, so on and so forth, but he kind of paved the way to create an art, a modern Indian art, which is rooted in our soil, and it can be, he is also known to have established what is known as the Bengal school of art. And there are also artists at that point of time who are known as revivalists. In order to protest against the huge presence of the European realistic art everywhere. Many Indian artists, they tried to revive the Indian traditional art once again. So, hence they are known as revivalists. In fact, partially in many of the paintings by Abanindranath Tagore, you can see that he is also partially revivalist. In the sense, he is trying to bring back some of the elements of traditional Indian, particularly miniature painting. But he is also a hybrid artist, because he was also looking at Japanese art, he was looking at folk art, he was looking at modern European art as well, and he is trying to not exactly do a patchwork, but trying to blend various elements in his work. But one of his best known works is this Bharat Mata, which he painted in 1905. It is so well known, it is so famous also because he did this painting at a time, at a very historical moment, when Bharat Mata became almost synonymous symbolically with the spirit of India, the free India. India was not yet free. India would become independent only in 1947, much later, almost 42 years later than this painting was painted. But already in this painting, Abanindranath was able to express visually the dream of the nationalist Indians, Indians who now wanted to get rid of this British ruler, get rid of this colonial life and live as an independent nation. So, Abanindranath and many others in different ways were trying to develop an art form which is not going to conform to any of the canons set by the British rulers. So, whether these paintings, for example, this one by Jamini Roy or next one again by Jamini Roy, look at these paintings. There are plenty of paintings by Jamini Roy. You can have a look at his paintings and see that though he is very modern, because he started his career doing very modern European kind of paintings, which he gave up very soon because he wanted to do something truly Indian yet modern. So, this is a new situation that the Indian artists are now negotiating. Previously, at the beginning of the colonial period, we saw that the artists were negotiating between traditional art forms and the new realistic elements which they had learned or they had seen in the European works. But now, it is a slightly different situation. It is not negotiating between the tradition and the European, it is a negotiation between tradition and the modern. And what kind of modern? Not European modern, but Indian modern. And Jamini Roy, beside Abanindranath Tagore and Amrita Shergill and Ravi Verma, could be cited as again a very important example, who instead of drawing his form, instead of sourcing his form from the already existing modern European art movements or art models, he looked back at our folk art traditions. You remember in our third week, last two modules we were looking at folk art. We were looking at its simplicity, spontaneity and a kind of spirit that most of these folk art forms carry within themselves. Jamini Roy was attracted to that, and he found that the folk art traditions could be his source for his modern art, and hence he derived his modern art, he developed his modern art from his experience of folk art. So, he himself is not a folk artist, but his development of folk art, his evolution of modern art, the root of his modern art was in folk art. So, this is another way of reacting, another way of doing art for a nationalist cause. Now, we have Nandalal Bose, again a very important artist in early 20th century. He lived a long life from late 19th century, and he lived through the first half of 20th century and died in 1966. Now, he was a pupil, a student of Abanindranath Tagore, but again when he developed his own language, his own freedom, Nandalal Bose was also doing works of art which are truly Indian, and particularly this one and next one are extremely important in our context today, because we are talking about the nationalist art, and these two paintings, this one and the previous one, were done along with many others for the Haripura Congress Convention in 1930s. Very interesting that for a Congress convention, Gandhi had asked Nandalal Bose to do these paintings to be displayed on the makeshift walls where that meeting would be held. So, in a way this is a public display, this is a public art, lot of people came and saw, and through these works Nandalal, with the encouragement of Gandhiji of course, was trying to develop a true, the concept of a true modern Indian art. Look at many of his murals by Nandalal Bose. A similar approach and a similar mindset can be seen. Not that he has completely relinquished what is traditional, but definitely he is not so prone to the Western methods. He is trying to build up his own method of painting, keeping certain traditional elements intact, but at the same time devising, innovating new ways. And yes, this is what I would like to point out very, very emphatically, that because of this feeling on part of the artists to align themselves with the nationalist sentiment, to align themselves with a kind of mindset which is looking forward to a free India, a free nation, to an independent India, which wants to get rid of the British rulers. Now, these artists, because of this feeling, because of this urge, were at the end of the day rewarded with a new art language. So, it is very interesting that this art for the cause or for a certain cause, art for the nation, led many of these artists to desperately look for a suitable language, I mean visual language, a suitable pictorial language. And Shantiniketan, interestingly, was an alternative school in that context. Established in 1919, the art school of Shantiniketan, known as Kala Bhavan, was right at the outset very clear that they are not going to follow the colonial system of art training, and they were also not going to follow the traditional system of art training. They are not going to, they were resolved to develop a new form of art pedagogy, a new form of art training based on real life observation, and also by studying our heritage art. Now, this resulted in some wonderful works by very important and stalwart artists of Shantiniketan like Binod Bihari Mukherjee, this one also. I mean, where do you categorize these paintings? Indian, Western, hybrid? Very difficult, because now we are witnessing the emergence of a new kind of art behind which a certain nationalist sentiment was very important, and at the same time an urge, a desire, a dream to create modern Indian art, not necessarily imitating what was happening in the West or the European modern art, but to develop a kind of a unique indigenous modern Indian art. So, Binod Bihari, and then followed by one of his contemporaries, very well known artists known as Ramkinkar Bej, and Ramkinkar Bej was particularly successful in developing a new modern language of sculpture, because previously either we had very typically traditional religious sculpture, or we had European realistic statue like sculpture commissioned by the British people or commissioned by the patrons who thought realistic sculpture is the best possible sculpture. I mean, there can't be any alternative to that. But here we have somebody like Ramkinkar, who developed a style which is neither overtly realistic nor outrightly symbolic, but he resolved this dilemma in a certain way that it creates a great energy. So, they are looking at the energy of the body, the power of the body, the social relationships between the figures, and also every sculpture can create or at least can evoke a history of its own. So, Ramkinkar that way is very important in terms of the modern Indian sculpture, and we have many more coming later on. While all these things were happening, we know there was this man, an extremely powerful man in all the possible creative fields. I am talking about, as you have already guessed rightly, Rabindranath Tagore, who was already known as a great poet, a great philosopher, great writer, but now at the late part of his life, he also started doing some paintings. Though initially he was slightly reluctant to show his paintings, because he thought, since he did not have any formal training, like the way Abanindranath had some formal trainings, he wouldn't be, his works are not worth looking at. But slowly people discovered that Rabindranath Tagore, like others, also decidedly not necessarily driven by a very obvious or a very conspicuous nationalist kind of sentiment or feeling, but definitely driven by a more global feeling, that we won't be confined by the definition given either by the colonial rulers or by the native Indians or by the tradition. So, Rabindranath did something like this one or the next one. He has done almost around 2000 paintings in last 15-16 years of his life. Many of them are available in many sources, so you can have a look at them, and you can see how this man was also contributing to that alternative art scenario within the context of the colonial rule. Remember, Rabindranath died in 1941, 6 years before India became independent. So, he was still under the colonial rule, yet he was able to come up with visual ideas and visual forms which were neither colonial nor traditional nor even hybrid, something completely new. So, Rabindranath Tagore should also be a very important example in this regard, also in terms of subject matter, in terms of the emotional intensity of his paintings. While he was doing all these paintings, and as you know, he, like Abanindranath and all, I mean, they all belong to that great Tagore family, illustrious family, culturally very talented family. And there was one more person whom we will be looking at briefly right now in this context. Before that, let me quickly summarize by saying that all artists did not react against the British colonial rule in the same way, though they might not have conformed. There is no question of conformity. They might not have conformed to the British colonial art system, yet they were not also reacting against the British colonial rule in the same way. Stylistically, artists differed from each other. They all did not necessarily react in the same manner. But one thing that united all of them was the nationalist urge to dream an independent India. In some way or the other, they all tried to create a national Indian identity, either through the style or the content, or by deviating from the colonial norms. For example, and this is what we will be looking at right now, some of these artists like Gaganendranath Tagore, who also belonged to the same family, Tagore's family, he was very direct in his artwork, particularly in his cartoons. Remember, it was not so easy that you are creating cartoons directly against your British rulers. I mean, it should have been considered as something very, he should be put in the sedition chart. I mean, It was so dangerous doing that, but he did it so powerfully, so beautifully, and he criticized the British rule very harshly. But then we also have artists, for example, like Jamini Roy, whom we have seen just now, who were rather establishing a new Swadeshi art theory or an art style as opposed to the colonial art practice, though they might not be attacking or criticizing the British rule in a very obvious way. Now look at this cartoon, this drawing by Gaganendranath Tagore. So it is very different from whatever we have seen so far. It is not the image of a scene or a particular portrait or any event, it is a cartoon. And also it is outrightly humorous. It is supposed to evoke some kind of fun, but there is a very strong satire, it is sarcastic, and this particular cartoon by Gaganendranath Tagore and many other cartoons by him actually repeatedly try to attack the brutal colonial rule against which the freedom fighters were fighting, and Indian people were desperately looking for an independent India. And Gaganendranath Tagore was not only criticizing the British rule, he was also criticizing many of the age-old conventions of Indian society, for example, the caste system. For example, the way the Brahmins always had thought that they were superior than the lower caste, things like that. So he has drawn cartoons on these issues, and this particularly, this one is very interesting also because of the captions. Now because it is a cartoon, not like any other painting, the artist needs to put a caption. So we have these works with a caption, and in this work the caption is given bilingually, both in Bangla and English. In Bangla it is called Prachanda Mamata, in English, translated into English it is terribly sympathetic. So because one of the British rulers had said in his speech that we are very sympathetic to our subject, that is Indians, native Indians, and the very next day he ordered his army to fire on the protesting Indian people. So he is making a comment on that, and as an extension of this nationalist art movement, we also come across artists like Chitta Prasad, Zainul Abidin, Somnath Hoare, all before independence, before 1947, who were directly showing, depicting and recording, not in a very photographic, in a very neutral kind of manner, but with lot of sympathy, with lot of empathy, a lot of emotional content also, some harsh, brutal reality of life of the deprived, of the life of the downtrodden, of the life of the oppressed. So this is one such a drawing of a figure who is impoverished due to the famine of 1943, and Chitta Prasad, Zainul Abidin, they used to move around and draw and sketch the dying people on the road. So these are very, in that sense, the language may not be very realistic. I mean, very few lines, very few strokes have been used, but the subject matter is utterly realistic, to the sense that nobody before these people, Chitta Prasad, Zainul Abidin, Somnath Hoare and others, have done such drawings and paintings before. They are directly looking at the abject poverty and harsh reality and making drawings out of that. So this is what, for example, this is also done before 1947, 1944. So he is doing this people. So by doing these kind of artworks, these people were also able to let us say emancipate, liberate art from the confines of very aesthetically pleasing art, because whether it is done by traditionalists or people belonging to the traditional sectors, traditional artists, or by the colonial artists, usually art has been considered as an object which should be primarily speaking aesthetically pleasing. Now these artworks done by these people, Zainul Abidin, Chitta Prasad, Somnath, are not aesthetically pleasing. They are aesthetically, morally, ethically, socially, and on the ground, humanitarian ground, they are terribly disturbing. So, it is this disturbance that has become the most important and significant quality of these works of art. And we will see that how the definition of reality as far as the visual artist is concerned is now going to change after this particular phase, after the independence. And this is what we will be looking at in the next module. Thank you.